Thank you everyone so much for joining. I am Katrina. I'm the East Coast brand ambassador for Starward Whiskey. I've been with the brand for about 4 years. I used to work at the distillery back in 2018 to the beginning of 2019. Had a bit of a disagreement with the immigration department. And David Vitale, who was going to be taking you through the entire tasting, who's the founder of Starward, was like, do you want a job in New York? And I said, I certainly do. And so now I've been based out of New York, working for Starward for about 3.5 years in this position. I hope that everyone got their tasting kits. We've got a really, really exciting lineup of the most important bits of Starward, like our core SKU, but also 2 little fun things. The final one, obviously, being the single barrel, which is just wildly special. It's the first of its kind. One of the first of its kinds to land in America. So we're really, really excited about that. I will probably be staying silent for most of this because we've got obviously Dave Vitale, who's the founder of Starward, that will take you through the entire tasting with some bits and bobs about how Starward came to be and how we are where we're at now. And so I'll throw it to Dave, and I'm here. I'll look at the chat, and if there's any questions that come up, I'll make sure that I flag them and enjoy. I hope we all get to try and understand and learn about some amazing new whiskey.
Thanks, Katrina. Welcome, everybody. Thank you. I'm actually based on the West Coast, so it's just around the perfect time for a whiskey, actually. 6 o'clock, just around dinner time. Some of us at the distillery would say it's almost 12 hours too late, like we've got a couple of breakfast whiskeys in our lineup. But I just want to say thank you for all of you to attend. I mean, we're at 41 and counting. This is great. You know, I think as you know, like said, like we're really kind of an unknown quantity in the United States. We've been working at this for quite some time. You know, it's our 15th anniversary this year. We're 15 years old, or young, I guess. With whiskies, they're still a baby. And you know, even within the Australian whiskey industry, there's some whiskey distilleries that are just cracking 30 years of age. So, you know, when we first started, it wasn't like we were necessarily the pioneers of Australian whiskey. That had already been done. In fact, you know, we had a huge gold rush in the late 19th century. So you could just imagine wherever there are miners, there's going to be an illicit still. No, that's kind of really, you can really trace back our whiskey making heritage and our love of whiskey back to that gold rush in Victoria, about 60 miles north of where the distillery is now located in Melbourne. And, you know, with that in mind, with the idea that actually we'd already been making whiskey, so I'd kind of developed this passion for whiskey. So what? You know what I mean? Like, we're already making great tasting whiskey in Australia. Why did I feel like we needed to take it a step further and you know, create our own distillery? And I think it's fair to say that those original distilleries were really, in fact, a lot of their early press releases were like, you know, we're making Australian whiskey in the finest of Scottish traditions. And, you know, last time I checked, we're pretty okay with whiskies made in the finest of Scottish traditions, you know, and we didn't need another one from Melbourne to do the same thing. So for me, it was really about pushing the boundaries of what whiskey can be, thinking about whiskey in a modern, contemporary fashion, and then starting to think about, like all great whiskies, what is it that we can talk about from a place perspective, from a provenance point of view? You know, and for me, that obviously means ingredient and climate, which is so important to whiskey, but also the culture of the place it's made. And so the whiskies tonight that I'm going to share with you, I guess, tell a little bit of that story of Australia and the Australian whiskey making heritage. And you know, we're gonna you know, take you for a walk in our Bond store and give you a bit bit of some interesting whiskies that we've got socked away. Does anyone have any questions that they want to kind of have answered? And I'd love for this to be interactive. So post them in the chat channel so that we can kind of, Katrina can kind of scan them, and I'll keep an eye on them too, so that if there's things you want to hear or learn more about, we'll definitely talk about that. And Paul's kind of started us off with, what typical cask size are we using? Paul, that's a really good question. It depends is the short answer. Starward almost exclusively uses Australian red wine barrels to age its whiskey. So of the tens of thousands of barrels in our bond store, you know, maybe there's 1,000 of them that are not red wine barrels. Like the sheer majority of them are all red wine barrel aged whiskies. And the big difference between red wine barrels from an aging perspective as opposed to a finishing point of view is that, you know, we're only getting that one hit of oak. So they're a little more balanced than you'll find with some finishes, wine finishes. And interestingly, because we're so close to these wine growing regions, we can have wine go out and whiskey go into the barrel sometimes within 24 hours. So wine's emptied at the winery tonight. The barrels are overnighted to the distillery. We give them a rinse, a light steam, just to open up the pores of the barrel, and then we'll put in the new make spirit, the immature spirit, straight into those barrels. No shaving, toasting, and recharring, no processing at all. And so the magic of that is that we're really getting a lot of that character from the oak in its sort of virgin format, but not, you know, I don't, who's had virgin oak barrels before, you know, virgin oak barrel aged whiskey. They can be quite intense, right? And the benefit of this is that intensity typically comes from tannins in the wood. And guess why a winemaker's using a wine barrel? They're using the wine barrel to get tannins into the wine. So they've softened that barrel up for us. So it's a lot more softer oak characters, a lot more of the oak itself and the fruit too. So red wine barrels is a big part of it. We're going to go into a bit more depth into that as we go along. But I reckon it's probably time to have our first one we're going to have.
David, let me interject for a second. I'll make this experience better, I guess, for everybody in the line. If you guys aren't talking, I'd appreciate it if you could just mute yourself, which make the experience more enjoyable for all of us. And using this opportunity, David, since I already interrupted you, I can just give you a heads up on what this audience is, because I think I should have started with that. So this is actually Single Barrel Club, and everybody who's joined today, I should say everybody, but 90% of people who joined today are a part of our club, and mostly we do bourbon or rye selections. People in this group aren't necessarily as exposed to other types of whiskey. Again, I don't want to speak for everybody. Everyone's mileage may vary, but for the most part, people here aren't experimenting with single malts or wine finishes. And not to make your job today a little bit more tougher, but I've heard, even from the members of this group, is that they actually tend to stay away sometimes from wine finishes. Why? Because it has to be just done just right. Because if you overdo it, those tannins get into the bourbon, and then you don't know what you're drinking. It's not wine, it's not bourbon, it's somewhere in between. It tends to be very dry. On the other side of things, we've seen a plethora of French oak finishes out in the marketplace, right? I can name you certain very well recognizable brands that are doing it. Some doing it because they know how to do it, and some doing it just to capitalize on the hype. And so this should give you at least a little bit of a background as to who you're presenting to today.
Perfect. Well, that's great. I appreciate that. And look, guys, you know, there's, you know, I don't want to pitch it too high. I don't want to pitch it too low. I can go as deep as you want into like any area of the production process. As Katrina will know, like I can talk until I'm blue in the face. And as long as there's still one person on this call, I'll still keep going. Like I'll talk to a postage stamp if it's got a face on it. So like we can talk all night about whiskey spelled both ways. I mean, I love it all. But obviously I have a soft spot for Starward. So yeah, you're totally right. Like red wine barrel finishes are really interesting because they're a finish, right? Like by law, bourbon needs to be in brand new American oak that's shaved, toasted, and recharged. And Michael kind of mentioned that, of course, all bourbon is in virgin oak. It starts in virgin oak for sure, but it's not quite the virgin oak that I'm thinking of. I'm thinking no shave, toasting, and recharring, right? And when you have no shave, toasting, and recharring, it can be quite extractive and very, very intense. So, shave, toasting, and recharring a barrel is so important because it softens those tannins and lignans in the oak, caramelizes the sweet sugars in the oak as well, and then creates something that's really like drink, right? We don't need to soften those tannins up because the gas are actually in the wine, right? And so the wine barrel kind of because the winemakers use the barrels maybe for one vintage, two vintages, or three vintages, we get a lot more of that softer oak character coming through. And so that means that, not only are we not getting 2 hits of oak, but the oak that we're getting is a lot more softer. And the first whiskey we're going to try tonight is twofold, which is probably the softest whiskey we've got in our portfolio. And it's basically a wheated whiskey. So we all know what wheat whiskies are. This is 60% wheat, 40% malted barley. And the magic of wheat, obviously, is that it's really round, soft, like creamy kind of texture that gives the whiskey sort of, I feel like some light space for those oak and fruit characters from the wine barrel to shine through. But the single malt, the 40% malt component is fermented like a beer without the hops, obviously. So that fermentation process is going to create a whole heap of fruit. Hey, Matt, thanks, buddy. So a whole heap of fruit, right? So that fruit character is then going to really kind of drive a lot of the signature Starward House style. So this whiskey is kind of a love child between a bourbon and Scotch. It's got a bit of those single malt characters from the malted barley that's aged in wine barrels separately, and it's got the wheat whiskey aged in wine barrels separately, and then we marry them together in a 60-40 split. So this is twofold. I'd love, and for me, like I said, that soft, round cereal character gives a really good kind of sort of lots of space for those fruit characters and the malt to kind of shine through. But I'd love to get some feedback. They're blended after distillation and aging, right? So basically we have a wheat spirit, we have a single malt spirit, and then we basically marry them together at the end, 60-40 split. Applejack cereal thing on the nose for sure, right? So that kind of fruit character, and a lot of that, there's actually orchard characters in the new make spirit, which come from fermentation. So you're definitely on the money with that sort of apple and cream. It's not malted wheat. It's basically unmalted wheat that's fermented with enzymes and then to convert into sugar and then run through a column still.
David, you must have already mentioned that, but I completely missed it. It says double grain. What are the grains in this?
Wheat and malted barley.
Okay.
Right, separately distilled and aged and then married together. And the malted barley grows, and the wheat for that matter, grows within a day's drive of the distillery. And it's kind of funny, obviously in America, that makes a lot more sense to you guys than it does in Europe. If I say a day's drive in Europe and I'm in Germany, that could be basically, the bottom of Spain, so like there, we kind of get it. It's within an 8-hour drive. Most of it's within 5 or 6 hours. We have it malted to our specification, which is a bit darker in color and character than you normally have for a distilling malt. And so that drives a lot of that sort of like lovely mouthfeel and lusciousness, which we're going to get in the next one even more so.
So actually, before getting to the next one, I can tell you, and again, a lot of guys on this call have been with me, or with us, I should say, on different barrel selecting trips or experiences. We normally kind of go through all of these samples or barrels we normally taste through, and we kind of like go nose first, and we rate the nose, and then we go and do the same for palate. We're not going to do that today because it's a little bit different. We're not really selecting anything, and we kind of judging each expression on its own. So what I would definitely suggest we do as a group, right? As David is talking about it, we nose it. You know, if you want to take down some of the notes for yourself, if you want to share that, that'd be great. But I'm like, I can start. I'm definitely getting the Applejack. Even before you mentioned that, I'm definitely getting that, and cereal actually as well. My kids just had it, so it's fresh in my memory. So those are two predominant notes for sure.
I think the other interesting thing is with Twofold, it's really interesting. If I do a sampling session and talk about, hey, do you want to try a wheat whiskey? Everybody picks up on the fruit characteristics because they're so different to what you'd find in a wheat whiskey. If I kind of go in there and say, do you want to try an Australian whiskey? Most people then kind of go, oh, this reminds me of Scotch. You know, so it's really funny depending on how we kind of pitch it to people, the preconceived ideas, that sort of like the biases that you have in your own mind kind of come forward. All of it's right, obviously. Those fruits, those darker raisins and fruits are coming from the barrel itself. You know, and the more, you know, the more we go down this, the next kind of sense, the next whiskeys that we're going to try, you know, you're going to get more of that. And, you know, Eric, you know, you're right on the money there in terms of like a single malt Irish like whiskey. You know, it's definitely got that pot distilled character because we've got that cereal note coming through, but also the wood policy is really light and delicate. Most of the Irish whiskey that outside of the premium ones, you know, is aged in ex-American oak bourbon barrels, right? So they've had already their extractive kind of power taken out of them by the bourbon. And so really those barrels are about resting the spirit. In this one here, they've still got a lot of juice left in them, you know, and, you know, we're going to talk a little bit more with Nova about this family tree of barrels that we get from wineries. And then I'll answer that question that I think it was Michael asked at the beginning, which is what size barrels we use. I haven't forgotten, buddy.
So I know you're modest enough not to
Cool,
say that,
cool.
not to mention that during the tasting, but maybe you're not. I don't know, but I'll ask this question. A, what's the proof on this thing? B, what's the availability nationwide? Because remember, people that are joining are all over. Like it's a national group, so your expression might or might not be available in those markets. And what's the price point for this?
Yeah, so broadly available, like, you know, nationally available through good independent retailers. Some, you know, and then online, you know, you should be able to get it shipped to you in like 40 odd states. So that's pretty good. It's sort of somewhere depending on which state you're in. I mean, I'm in Washington state, so it's about $3,000 over here with the taxes that we have to pay. But you know, in California, it sits between 30 and 35 bucks. I think, you know, the Northeast is pretty much around that $32 to $35. Same in the South. So, you know, we wanted to make this sharing cabinet whiskey, you know, something that, you know, you can have on your drinks trolley and say to a buddy, hey, you know, I bet you haven't tried this before. It's really delicious and you know, you know, I think you should give it a go. It's aged in wine barrels, which is really interesting. Does the freshness of the wine barrel determine how long it is aged? No, like we typically age our whiskeys for 3 to 4 Melbourne years. And someone's going to ask, what's a Melbourne year, I'm sure. And we'll come back to that. But the 3 to 4 years basically means that we've got time as a fixed sort of constant. And then depending on whether the barrels are filled wet, wine out, whiskey in, or some of the barrels are basically recoopered and resized, at that 3 to 4 year mark, we're going to get different light and shade. So when you go to a rick house, outside walls, top of the rick house is going to be very, very different to in the middle down low, right? Different microclimates. We don't have that luxury, but what we do have is different wood policies from winemakers. And then I guess we also treat the barrels a little differently to kind of get that sort of diversity in the bond store that you'd find, you know, in a rick house by different locations. And we're going to talk a lot more about that with Nova coming up next. So 3 to 4 Melbourne years, and people kind of say, Dave, what the heck is a Melbourne year? Has anyone been to Melbourne? Yeah, Ken, when did you go? You're on mute.
Yeah, I was in the Marine Corps, and we went through on a carrier and went in through Melbourne. We went through basically all the way around Australia. So
Great. So, you know, I mean, I think the key point, is particularly by sea, you kind of get the sense of how big this bloody country is. And the interesting thing
Huge.
is, you know, it's not that much smaller than the United States, but as opposed to, you know, you being able to travel, what, 300 or 400 miles before you get to at most, to a town. In Australia, you can go 1,000 miles and not, you know, there's a desert, a big, you know, thousands of miles desert in the middle of Australia.
yeah,
And so
nothing in the
obviously,
middle.
you know, it's basically the whole middle. So all of the cities kind of hug the coastline. And Melbourne's in the southeast part of Australia. So depending on whether the weather's coming from the north, i.e. from the desert into Melbourne, it'll be hot, dry, you know, think Death Valley kind of winds, you know, really hot and dry winds coming into Melbourne. But if it's coming from the southwest, we've got another desert. It just happens to be to our south, called Antarctica. And so that'll pick up really a lot of humidity. And, you know, it's quite cold, not below zero, not below freezing, but it'll come into Melbourne in a great rush. So within a day, we can have 30 to 40 degree Fahrenheit temperature variation, huge variations, kind of famed for 4 seasons in a day, and it literally happens. And so in summer, it can be 105 and you're sweating bullets. And then within 25 minutes, it'll drop down to 70. And in winter, it'll be mild, like 70 to 75, and it'll drop down to 40, you know. And so it's, you know, highly variable. And Eric, that's a really good point. Like Texas is quite similar, particularly the ones that are in high altitude. The difference is that it's very, very dry. You know, there's not much humidity in most of the Texas distilleries that I've been to. So typically the proof goes up at those distilleries. In Melbourne, we've got equal amounts of humidity and dry wind. So it's quite a balanced sort of environment over the year. So our proof stays the same. So we fill all of our barrels at 110 proof. And typically our barrel proof whiskies, our single barrels, come out between 110 and 113 proof. So, you know, that's gives you an idea that we're not losing more water or alcohol. It's pretty balanced through the bit. It's a little dry because of our summers, but that's basically it. So, you know, that climate means we've got highly reactive barrels that in 3 to 4 years give us this smooth, easy drinking, very, very nuanced and delicate whiskey. Like I said earlier, I think of this as our breakfast whiskey, you know, put it on top of some oatmeal in the morning, perfect with a side of eggs, you know, just kind of easy drinking whiskey that sort of opens people's mind, that, you know, well-crafted, easy to drink whiskey that tastes a little different because of those fruit characters can come from other parts of the world. And, you know, at a really accessible price point. That was the objective of Twofold, right? Just to kind of get something that could be in everybody's sharing cabinet as just for every day. And so the wheat component of Twofold is column. The malt component is double pot distillation. And that's probably a good segue, thanks Katrina, onto Nova. Nova is effectively the 40% malt component that's in Twofold. So we've got 60-40 wheat malt. Nova is effectively that 40%. So we're deconstructing twofold by drinking Nova. If that makes sense. And so in this guy, you're going to get a bit more of a luscious mouthfeel. You're going to get way more of that orchard tropical fruit coming from the malt whiskey. And then that wood policy really comes forward now with those wine barrels. We, and I think you'll get a lot of, like I noticed before we talked about raisins, they're definitely going to be there. Some people pick up some cacao and chocolate notes, cherry for sure. Okay, what type of wine is it? Smell like a red delicious apple for sure. That's fermentation of the malt character. So let's go deep into red wine barrels. Peaches for sure. We're going to get that even more on the next one. Red wine barrels. So we source all of these barrels from Australian winemakers. We don't make our own wine. And these winemakers are within that day's drive of the distillery. And big Aussie reds are typically Shiraz and Cabernet. We also have locally cool climate Pinot Noirs that grow south of Melbourne, within about 50 miles of the distillery. So Shiraz, Pinot, and Cabernet are the types of wine we use. Now, winemakers, we think of a family tree. We're going to have French oak and American oak at the top. Then next down on that, we're going to have size. So different winemakers will use 100-litre barrels, octaves, 200-litre barrels, 225 barriques, most like an American bourbon barrel in terms of size and geometry, and 300-litre barrels, hogsheads. So size is next. So French oak, now we've got 6 types of barrels. Below that, we've then got the type of wine that it's been in, Shiraz, Cabernet, Pinot. So we've gone to 18. And then those winemakers, depending on what they're making, will have kept the barrel for one vintage. So if you're, for example, a big Aussie red Shiraz producer making wine, say, for China, they love extractive wood, oak flavors in their wines. So effectively, the winemaker has to turn those barrels over every single vintage to get that big, bold oak flavor in the wine. Guess what? We get them and they're basically still brand new, right? So one vintage at the winery is going to be very, very different to 4 or 5 or 6 vintages of winery, like a Pinot. So we've gone from 18 to 36. Then we've got first fill Starward barrels and second fill Starward barrels, 72. And then on top of that, we've got wet filled fresh barrels, wine out, whiskey in. And we've got those shaved toasted recharred barrels, 144. And then on top of that, we've got wheat and malted barley. So there's about 280 different types of barrels that we use to make twofold, and about 140 odd that we use to make Nova. And so you can see very, very quickly, yes, we do. We do second fills. Third fills, very rarely. They're kind of, in that climate, they're spent for us by that stage. But our local brewing community love them. They win. They get about, a gallon of whiskey in the barrel that sort of like is into the barrel that they get to use for their stouts, or I just had one that was a hazy IPA barrel aged Starward, which is delicious. Raspberries and cream, 100%. This is like at about the 18-month mark, just raspberries and cream. We can't call whiskey in Australia, we can't call something Australian whiskey.
I got the video turned off.
Been aged for a minimum
I got
of
the
2
video
years.
turned off.
So a minimum of 2 years is the minimum requirement that we have for Australian whiskey. We go to 3, but if we could release something at 18 months, it'd just be strawberries and cream, this blush colored whiskey, which is bloody delicious. Jamie reckons Nova takes the funk and fruit from twofold and makes it light and butterscotch by comparison. I see where you're going with that. I know what you mean by funk. It's a different, like it's actually the cereal character it's the it's the way, it's the column distillation that kind of creates that funk, for want of a better term, because the wood policy, the family tree is effectively the same. Sometimes we skew a little larger to give the whiskey a bit more lightness in twofold. But typically that cereal kind of funk note comes from the wheat spirit. Do you know where in Washington State these are available? Total Wine & More has Nova. High Spirits in Paulsbo has the whole portfolio, and are also getting a single barrel soon too. Wayland, are you in Washington State? I'm assuming. We should catch up for a drink. Let's do it. Nova, any other thoughts? Oh, wow. Look at this. You're on mute.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm just trying to see who's paying attention, that's all. I can tell you that both of these, I mean, on a serious note, I guess, both of these whiskeys, to me, they drink like, and somebody mentioned that, and I think right on point, much like Irish style, very
No wires or anything.
smooth. I'd say. I hate that word, but I mean, they drink very smoothly. And what was the proof point on these? I remember you.
Twofold and 82 for Nova. And the reason for that is we just wanted sharing cabinet approachable whiskey. And what we wanted was distinctive flavor profiles. The 5 whiskeys that inspired Starward were Johnny Walker Black, because it's bloody consistent. Like over 200 years. I've had the privilege of tasting some from the 1960s, the 70s, the 90s, the noughties, and today, and you can thread a needle through it. It's so consistent. So Johnny Walker Black, Maker's Mark, wheat, really kind of talked about premium before premium was a thing, Wild Turkey, because, well, it's Wild Turkey. Lefroy 10-year-old, which is that peaty, smoky whiskey that, like, you're drinking it when you pull the cork, and the Balvenie Doublewood, which is a amazing single malt Scotch whiskey. So it's not just whiskey. In fact, there's no Irish in there, right? But the idea behind it really was that I wanted a distinctive flavor profile, a really distinctive flavor profile, but without the intensity that you get from those, say, for example, peated whiskeys. I didn't want it to poke you in the eye with these wine flavors or the tannins. And so for me, the beauty of these 82 proof whiskeys is that they're just really sessionable, easy drinking whiskeys that, you can pour yourself 3 fingers, and actually, particularly with 2 Nova, the more you drink it, the more it just reveals itself. One, I'm going to find out. We've got some in Arizona. I just need to find out where they are. Hang tight. I'm on Bainbridge Island.
And shameless plug, all of these selections you guys can actually purchase from either one of our retail partners if you can find them locally.
So someone mentioned spiky pine wood almost from Nova. I think that spice that you're getting, like, we kind of think of that as a little bit of a, aromatic spice, is French oak. The French oak barrels kind of do that, like at the top of that family tree. French oak wet-filled barrels often kind of have that sort of cedar wood, kind of pine, Doug fir. My Pacific Northwest credentials are coming out now, kind of flavor profiles. Any other questions, comments? All right, now we're going to take a little bit of a, yeah, exactly. Yeah, Paul, that's exactly right. So, Eric, they're full aging, just to be clear, right? So they're full aging in red wine barrels. If I had to just choose one out of those 140 barrel types that we pick to make Nova, for example, it'd probably be a wet filled American oak barrique, which is 225 from the Barossa Valley, which would have had Shiraz in it. They deliver every single time. We know the cooperage really, really well. They're selecting those barrels from, and air drying them for like 4 years plus before the wine hits them. And so they're just, there's so much generosity that they give.
Had it.
Um,
We saw that last time. It goes in my room.
All right, let's make a little bit of a U-turn because we've been talking about red wine and happy to come back to that later on. The next one we're going to try is Solera. Now, Solera is actually not one of those red wine barrels. It's still a single malt. So the first two whiskey we tasted basically have the same wood policy. The spirit is different. With Solera, the single malt is the same, the spirit is the same, but the barrels are different, right? So what you're going to have in similarity is the spirit profile, but the wood policy is different here. This whiskey is, I'm just having a look at, is it a Nouge? The wine barrels are not charred or toasted, or you don't recharge them. Yeah, they would have been, the winemaker would have at least toasted the barrel, but not given it a shaved toast, not giving it a, alligator skin char at all, because that kind of defeats the purpose for them of using those beautiful, elegant wine barrels. But if we don't fill the barrels quickly, the wine turns into vinegar, and red wine vinegar aged whiskey doesn't taste great. Ask me how I know. So we've got to do something with those barrels, and that's why we basically, toast those, rechar those barrels, just to give them, to preserve the flavor. Now, Solera is actually our first whiskey. I started making this whiskey or thinking about this whiskey 15 years ago. And actually the whiskey that we're drinking was first made in 2010. So this is some of the oldest whiskey you're going to have tonight. Not all of it is from 2010, but basically we use a Solera system. So the whiskey is, this particular whiskey was our first whiskey that we launched in 2013. I was so committed to making a consistent whiskey from batch to batch, like that inspiration of Johnny Walker that's really consistent from batch to batch, that we filled a vat, a huge stainless steel vat. It's about 1,200 gallons, which was huge for us back then. About $1 million worth of whiskey put away that was aged. It was aged whiskey, and our first batch of Solera was only 100 gallons. And every batch of Solera since then has been 100 gallons. But before we do the next batch, we top the 100 gallons back up with aged whiskey. So every single barrel of Starward Solera that we've emptied is in your glass. It might be kind of strung out and, in homeopathic quantities, those first ones, but every single barrel that we've emptied is in our glass. Now, what type of barrel is this? It's very, very different to our red wine barrels, right? Stone fruits, apricots, peaches, legs, hazelnuts for sure. That's a really good one. Orange creamsicle, definitely, like those. I think of it as orange rind, candied orange rind. Basically, what we do is, you don't quite smell legs. Very funny, Jamie. Very good. That was good. Basically, we take out 100 gallons at a time and make a batch of Solera, top it back up again. So the youngest whiskey is always at least 3 years of age, probably closer to 4 with a pair of barrels. These Apera barrels are basically Australian sherry. You can't call it sherry because it doesn't come from Spain. So it's called Apera. Apera like aperitif. The barrels, when we get them, are 40 to 50 years of age. The reason why we're getting them is because no one's drinking Apera anymore. They're all dying. They're all like everybody's aunts and grandmas are dying, and they're not drinking, sherry in those big flagons. And so they're basically decommissioning these barrels. And so we've been fortunate enough to be able to get a really good relationship with these winemakers that have got fortified wine barrel inventory. But because they're so old, these ones are shaved, toasted, and recharred, and also resized. So that 100-liter, 200-liter, 300-liter system we talked about beforehand also happens with the Apera barrels. And so basically, this is my $1 million promise to. It's actually worth more now because the tax has gone up and the value of the whiskey's gone up. But it's our $1 million promise to consistency. I could have emptied that vat so many times, and let me tell you, all of this white hair is proof that that we needed it at some point, but we didn't, because I wanted to kind of keep that consistent product from batch to batch and deliver on that promise that what you're tasting now you can buy online, and it might be the previous batch or it could be the next batch. They're going to be pretty close. They're going to be very, very close. In fact, we try and do a triangle tasting on these to get that consistency right. This is at 86 proof, a little higher again, but really luscious, mouth coating, textural whiskey that's sort of just delicious, and those because we shake each
More
one of them.
so than the first two, for sure. At least for me, it's just more. I get more of everything in this one.
More of everything.
Yeah.
It's just a lovely sipping whiskey, a lovely sipping whiskey. Makes an amazing old fashioned if you want to be a bit more decadent. And just for me, one of when we first started, a real big departure from what was going on in the Australian whiskey scene at that point in time. A lot of it was a direct facsimile of Scotch whiskey in port barrels or ex-bourbon barrels. And so when we sort of started to look at how we could be different, these Apera barrels were a real big departure. Still sherry, but no one was calling it sherry. I didn't call it sherry, called it Apera, and really fruity, very, very, very fruit forward.
I have to tell you something. So personally, and this is one of one, I just speaking for myself, I'm yet to find a wine finish that I like in my whiskey. I find it hard combination to execute properly, at least to my palate. The wine finishes, technical wine finishes that I do like are all fortified. And I looked at the Solera because I really like this expression, and I looked at it, and sure enough, it says fortified, and you're talking about it. And I know I'm jumping a gun, but the barrel we selected, that was also not your typical red wine finish. So just stands to reason, I guess. But kudos to you. This is great. This is a very tasty expression.
Yeah, and look, Michael just talked about oily mouthfeel, lingering finish. These are kind of characters that, obviously as the proof point comes up, the spirit character of Starward sort of shines through more. And that's what you get from that brewing barley that we talked about before, that we kind of really focused on getting to the distillery and fermenting with. Someone mentioned those nut characters before. That's all fermentation as well. And part of the fact that we're using darker colored malts gets that flavor profile coming through. And you're totally right. One of the things that we're always very wary of, just looking at Mike, wine barrel finishes, particularly those fortified wine barrels, can get really sickly sweet, and this isn't. This is in balance. And what we try and do, the definition of balance at Starward, if you think about the first three whiskeys that we've had, is that the spirit profile comes through, luscious mouthfeel, really, length, orchard characteristics, those stone fruits, and the kind of nuttiness to it. The oak character comes through, whether it's French oak with those piney kind of cedar notes, or American oak, which we all know and love, vanilla and kind of caramel sort of flavors, and the fruit flavor of the wine, right? So think of it as a triangle. And so what we want is an equal-sided triangle when we're crafting these whiskies. And what I love about each of these three, in different ways, they deliver on that, just at different intensities. And so obviously we need a little bit more proof with those fortified wine barrels because they're going to deliver a bit more of that flavor. The barrels have also been shaved, toasted, recharred. So there's going to be a bit more oak flavor. So everything needs to amp up. So the triangle's a little bit bigger, right? Whereas with twofold, wheat, spirit, column distilled, single malt, bigger barrels, you know, different balance profile, but still in balance, just a bit more nuanced. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Wayland, I guarantee you they've got twofold. Pete, the owner there, loves it. So unless he's drunk at all, I guarantee you they've got twofold. So, Michael, what type of rickhousing do we do? We've got about 3 acres of storage now for Starward. 3 acres of storage. The barrels are stacked about 7 high, not very high at all. And then what we like is maybe 5 or 6 feet between the top barrel and the roof, right? So we're getting a lot of interaction between, you know, the outside climate and the inside climate. Paul, they used to be palletized, and it was kind of neat back in the day. One pallet was 4 100-liter barrels or 2 200-liter barrels, which just so happened to be, well, I should say our barley used to be delivered on pallets, and 1 pallet of barley would make exactly the same amount of whiskey that you could store on a pallet. So it was a great reuse of that pallet. But more, you know, since we've scaled up, we've now got a big silo with about 30 tons of barley that gets delivered every week. And so we're using wine racks. And the benefit of wine racks is that they actually provide way more airflow between the barrels, which helps with aging. Wayland, we'll have to talk about Solera.
Yeah, in the whiskey world, sometimes that term, the terminology, or at least that method, sometimes get, you know, snickered upon, if that's an expression. Like, people don't necessarily, I guess, appreciate the Solera method, even though there are very good tasting expressions that come out from different distilleries, obviously yourself included. For example, and somebody mentioned that on a call, there's a New York-based distillery called Hill Rock, and they do a pretty solid job in their Solera expressions. But do you guys use the method? Is this why it's called Solera? You might have touched on it, but I completely missed it.
It's a different method. You know, like a traditional Solera that you see in fortified wine barrels is basically the pyramid of barrels. Too complicated, too many hoses for me, right? Like so we just basically reinterpreted that pyramid into a vat. And so we started with 1,200 gallons, and then we've never emptied that vat. It's only been just you know, we give it a good mixing up. It's at barrel proof. And then we just basically take out enough to do the next batch of Solera, and then top it up with aged whiskey. So it's all finished aged whiskey. But the oldest of that whiskey now is approaching, it'll be 10 on the 20th of December this year. That's when we filled the Solera vat.
It's sort of like an infinity vat for you.
Exactly. Hill Rock was, from memory, Dave Pickerel was involved in that one, right? Yeah, well, say no more, right? I mean, of course, it's great stuff. So I actually haven't tried their Solera, but I should get my hands on it.
Oh, we're not here to talk about them, but
Right.
Solera
yeah,
is one of the my
Whiskey
favorite one is
Fine ways, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, look, I mean, Solera is my sentimental favorite, I guess. It's the one that kind of set us on our way. Without it, we wouldn't be here now, because I needed to kind of really change the narrative about Australian whiskey in Australia. It was very much Scotch whiskey at that point in time. And so you can see that this is really different, really, really a big departure, but still close enough for people to make the leap. That's always a challenge when you're disrupting, right? You don't want to make the leap so big that people go, this is crazy. I'm going to take a wide pass on this until, I see what happens later on. And so we're really fortunate enough to kind of win some great accolades within 2 months of launching the brand, and then that sort of set us on our way and built up a reputation, so that when we did a single malt red wine barrel aged whiskey, people were like, well, I know Starward does great things. And then when we came out with a wheated whiskey in red wine barrels, everybody kind of came along the journey. But if I'd started with a wheat whiskey, 46 proof, or 86 proof or 100 proof wheat whiskey, people just would have thought I was crazy, and we wouldn't be here. So you got to bring people along a journey along the way. And it was funny because when I started, we were in an old Qantas maintenance hangar out at at our airport, and people thought this is a really random place to make whiskey, right? There should be a stream or like a limestone shelf to source water from. Where's the barley fields, and where's, it's like, well, you know what? They were really important things when we're making whiskey 200 years ago. You had to go to them, right? You needed to go to where the water was. You needed to go where the agriculture was. Fortunately, today we can be an urban distillery, and actually the water comes to us, the barley comes to us, and we can kind of take advantage of all of them, the benefits of being in a city, like talent, great winemakers who don't want to work in rural Australia love working for us. They're our blenders, great brewers at microbreweries that get really bored making, the same pale ale or hazy IPA, love working with us because it's, another kind of aspect to their resume that they can fill out and sort of take that brewing mindset into whiskey, which is a very, very new way of thinking. So all those sorts of things happen because we sort of left behind tradition. And as much as I love whiskey, Scotch whiskey, Irish, bourbon, rye, especially, you can't out Scotch, you can't out rye. So for me, it was about turning up with something that was distinctly Australian that we could kind of take to the world. Just having a look at so Michael,
Sorry to interrupt, but I think you're opened a lot of eyes with this one. I think so far out of those three that we've tasted, this is a clear winner. Not that anything wrong with the first two, but like I said, myself included, and I think I speak for most people, we just get a lot more of everything.
More of everything, absolutely. I mean, this is more, and that's kind of been structured this way, right? We get a lot of people. We've moved from the aircraft hangar to a distillery about a mile from downtown Melbourne. It's 1 acre under roof. It's beautiful. If you ever come to Melbourne, please let me know, and I'll hook you up with a Dave sent me kind of tour. The magical thing there is that we've got a 300-person whiskey bar, and we hold functions there. And with Twofold, we often mix it with tonic or soda. People don't even know they're drinking whiskey, right? It's just a delicious drink that's easily mixed. It's easily sipped. It's exceptionally well crafted, double gold medal winning, all the things, right? But, is it a whiskey drinker's whiskey? Not every day. It's probably at breakfast time, Whereas when we go further along, then now we're starting to talk about the whiskeys you're going to turn to if you just want something to kind of deliver every time, right?
I'll tell you this, just to inject a little humor into this. A lot of people on this call, like I said, have been with us either in person or have done whiskey barrel selections virtually. You guys in Australia, so hey, if we have enough interest to fly out there and do one in person, I'm all for it. You're just going to have to send us a few bottles to, kill some time on a plane, so that the whole 14-hour flight becomes a little bit more pleasant.
We'll mule some bottles onto a plane. We won't ask questions as to how we get them on there, and then we'll have a good time on the flight, because it is, it's a 14 hours from LA, so
I'm only half kidding, by the way. Anyway.
It's a journey, that's for sure. But they're a lot of fun, you know, when getting to the distillery, because we can kind of take you for a walk through those 140 different types of barrels. And, you know, that's the magical thing. Just think about that. We could release a single barrel every single week of the year and still not come back to the same barrel after 2.5 years. Every week, you know, and so that's the diversity we've got in the Bond store, which is pretty exciting. Shall we move to the next one? How are we going for time, by the way?
We're coming up on the top of the hour, so we've been on this call for about an hour. I'm in no rush, but I can't speak for everyone. But I think we're coming to two most, well, not exciting, but I guess two more rare select whole flight. So I think if people stuck around this long, they might as well stick around for a little longer.
We've kept it, you know, perhaps the best to last. So this is one of those, this is one of those 144 barrels. So we're still single malt. Oh, Michael, I just wanted to clarify. Twofold is a wheated whiskey, 60% wheat, 40% malted barley, wheat whiskey. Nova, Solera, this next whiskey that we're just about to taste, Octaves, and the last whiskey, and the last whiskey is a wheat whiskey. So single malts are kind of the same definition. It's obviously not single malt Scotch because we can finish in, like, the definition is a lot broader in Australia in terms of what it is compared to Scotch, but single malt, these would all be characterized as single malt whiskies in Scotland for sure. In terms of
Which
process.
is interesting because if you actually, this is something that I've learned just dealing with people that are into bourbon and not as much into scotches or single malts. If you do this blindly and you don't disclose what they're actually tasting, I would venture a guess 5 times out of 10, if not more, they'll actually select a single malt that kind of drinks like a bourbon. Because when people think about scotches, what comes to mind? Peat, right? And people kind of stay away from that. If you're a bourbon drinker, you tend to gravitate more towards sweeter notes, which peat is not. But not all single malts are created equal, and certainly not yours. So it's just an interesting observation. But if you're talking about bourbon drinkers and people that say, well, I don't touch single malt, they're cutting themselves short by not venturing out and trying some new stuff, which exactly. Yes.
So this next whiskey, the Octaves, is from one winery, one sized barrel, one type of grape, from one vintage, in one paddock. In fact, like, the grape is not just one type of grape, it's one paddock of grapes. So basically this is super scarce and rare. It's available though in the US under like high allocation. Basically, the Octaves are from one winery called the Yalumba Winery. They have their own cooperage on site, and we're the first winery that I actually worked with to age in red wine barrels. I've done fortifieds, easy. But red wine barrels was a big step, particularly those wet-filled wine barrels, wine out, whiskey in, because the common convention, whether it's fortified wines, whether it's ex-bourbon, whether it's brand new oak and charred, the convention is you char a barrel before putting spirit into it, at least once. And so we weren't doing that. It was wine out, whiskey in. Big bet the farm moment for me, to just going to go all in on this wet filling process for the full aging. And Yalumba were the first winery we worked with. Octaves is also a size of barrel. It's a 100-liter size barrel. So smaller barrel means more surface area contact per liter, per gallon. So we're getting more extraction, right? As you would say, a standard size barrel. This is at 96, right? So you're going to get more of that lusciousness, the lingering flavors. Whereas with Solera, a lot of those bright, dried, sweeter fruits, this is going to be the red wine characteristics coming through now, and the oak, right? Most of this, if not all of it, is American oak, air-dried American oak for 4 years. Really high-grade quality barrels. like I said, it's a family winery. They have their own cooperage on site. So they buy the lumber flat, ship it to Australia, season it for 3 or 4 years, and then use it to make a barrel into these 100-liter barrels. And then the wines that they put in this are their old growth Shiraz vines that are over 150 years of age. So it's their top of the crop kind of wine in these quarter casks in the 100-liter barrels that are kind of driving the flavor of this whiskey. This is basically Supernova. Can't call it that because there's another small distillery on Isla that's created a whiskey called Supernova. But basically, if you think of Nova, this is Nova all kind of juiced up, right? More of the same, but just really juiced up with those red wine characteristics. Yeah. And so here's what we were talking about before, right? You're getting, you know, the first two whiskeys were deliberately kind of approachable, accessible, sharing cabinet, bring people into whiskey kind of whiskeys. These ones here are for whiskey drinkers that are completely happy drinking 100 proof whiskeys, completely happy kind of taking barrel picks. And we wanted to kind of deliver something for them too. And this is kind of where this sort of sits. Solera, Octaves sit here, the single barrels sit here as well.
Which is this crowd. This crowd enjoys a higher proof whiskeys.
But you know, and it's funny though, like my original passion was actually in beer. This was supposed to be a brewery gone, but I kind of made the whiskey all, you know, the beer all grown up into whiskey, right? And it's really funny because I think if you're a craft beer drinker, you kind of go through this journey of like, oh, I'll start off with a pale ale, and then you might try an IPA, and then you have a hazy IPA, and then you do a double IPA that's dry hopped at the bar. And, you know, before you know it, it's sort of like you're overwhelmed with like hops and there's a little bit of beer in the background. And guess what? You know where you end up? Back at a crisp, light, easy drinking Pilsner, right? And so, you know, for me, Twofold and Nova have their place, right? They are the sessionable whiskeys within the Starward portfolio, but we can go all the ways, right, in terms of intensity and flavor profile because we've got that depth and complexity in the Bond store. 4.5 years, Mike Jr. Just a little older, smaller barrels though. So we're gonna, you know, like that extra 6 months, 6 to 9 months in a smaller barrel probably gives it, relatively speaking, 2 extra years. Does this Starward benefit from releasing the serpent with a few drops of water to make the fruit come? Ah, yeah, great question. So, yes, is the short answer. Water is Starward's friend. And that's why if you go back to a Nova, just on the nose, you get, and Twofold for that matter, you get way more of those delicate fruits coming out. That here is just, you know, far more kind of, it's tight here. But you know, you add water, these all open up. You think about that, you know, in the context of a lot of barrel proof whiskeys, when you add water, they become a bit flabby. You know, they're only really should be drunk at barrel proof. This is the opposite. And the reason for that, this is Starward's secret sauce, is the wine. The wine characters actually play better at lower proof points. Wine, you drink wine at 15% ABV. So the more water you add, the more the flavors actually open up. And that's why these make great cocktail whiskeys as well, right? Because you're diluting, but the whiskey's still there. The spirit's still there, but those lovely oak and fruit characters are there as well. Eric, that's my approach, wetting the palate, like getting a juicy palate before kind of drinking. It's kind of my hack for new drinkers. This is what I often tell people that have never drunk whiskey before, is like, only put as much whiskey in your mouth as you have saliva in there. So get a really juicy palate and then add a little bit of whiskey to it. You've effectively halved the proof and also kind of given it sort of like some length, you know, some volume to kind of experience the whiskey without the full intensity of the booze. But for, you know, booze hounds like us, that's not a problem.
I guess I should stop you know, sniffing salt and doing shots of whiskey. Oh wait, that's a different spirit. Hold on, never mind.
So this is special. This is very, very special. I mean, they're all special, right? But like, this is a special whiskey for me because it's working with the winery that I first started working with to age whiskey in red wine barrels. And that's kind of the signature profile. Like I said, 99% easily of the inventory we have in the bond store is red wine now. And it wouldn't have happened without this winery and this whiskey that we're drinking right now, this type of whiskey that we really surprised everybody when we launched it. So, you know, you can see why at these higher proofs, we start to kind of get those big double gold medals and accolades from international award companies. It's so different, but still really delicious and still a whiskey, which is, you know, very hard to do. Like, you can make different stuff, not often very delicious, right? Or if it's delicious, it's kind of lost its whiskey credentials. So to get all three right, still a whiskey, still delicious, but different is hard as well. So that's what Starward's about at the end of the day.
And I mean, I know I've been joking around all night, but like kudos to you on executing that properly. Again, there is a member that I'm thinking specifically. Unfortunately, he couldn't make this call today, but he's my neighbor. Him and I had conversations about wine finishes, and both of us couldn't find one that's done just right. And I think you have a lot of winners here. And so again, job well done.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because look, you know, we've been doing this for now, like we've been entering in competitions for the better part of 10 years. And because of my kind of, I'm a slave to consistency, the whiskey hasn't changed all that much in that 10 years. But funnily enough, like this year we cleaned up, like we got 13 double gold medals, distillery of the year, like in the US, and then like won the whiskey masters in London. And I think people's kind of perception of the way we're producing whiskey is changing more than what we're doing is changing in a way. Like, and you know, quality is, I mean, everybody's making quality whiskey. It's never about the quality, right? You don't stick around for 15 years if you're not making quality liquid. It's more people's perception of what's interesting and what well crafted means to them as they go through this. And I think that like it's been great for us to kind of finally be recognized, because it gets to a point, is like, is it us or like is it, you know, the rest of the world? And you know, it's kind of nice. It's nice to finally be recognized with those, you know, international awards that sort of come back to what you're saying of like, yeah, actually they can be executed well, you know, and balance is the key. And you got to know what you're doing with the wine barrels. You know, for example, if we did all of this in Pinot barrels, this wouldn't be as juicy as it is. But we need the Pinot barrels to balance it out, right? And so you see a lot of bourbons and single malt American whiskeys in Pinot barrels. That's a wise choice, because if you're a Pinot producer, you probably had the barrel at the winery for 6 or 7 vintages, right? So the oak, the extractive wood aspect is very light on, but all of the wine accents are going to come through, right? And so there's different approaches to wood policy that you need to understand. And that's why we've got winemakers on the team. And that's why I was so lucky with the octaves to work with this particular winery. And it was sheer luck, right? Pure ass on my part, because I didn't even know, I knew they made good wines, but I didn't know they had a cooper on site. And so I could ring him up and say, his name's Jock. You know, you can just imagine this Aussie guy in really short shorts, coopering barrels, like, you know, with a cigarette in his mouth. And like, I'd say, Jock, why is barrel 3 so different to barrel 4 when on the front they were filled the same year and the front says American oak on both of them? And can you go, give me a sec, I'll figure it out. And he'd flick through the pages, and then, you know, something like, you know, you'd say, oh, well, I can tell you why. Like barrel 4 was actually left over from lumber from last year. So it's been air dried an extra year, right? And I can then go, okay, so longer air drying provides these sorts of flavor profiles in American oak versus shorter air dry in American oak 100-liter barrel. We could start to kind of build up our own profile of what it means to age our whiskey in an accelerated format, because we had access to these winemakers. Why did we call it Starward? Really good question. We wanted to be a contemporary whiskey, like a modern whiskey that talks to the place it's made, right? And, you know, to me, whiskeys up until that point were people, places, and animals. Wild turkey, famous grouse, places, Buffalo Trace. You've got, well, now Hill Rock Estate, you've got Balvenie, all of the glens, you know, are places, and people, Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, Johnny Walker, you know, Shivers Brothers. And so for me, it was like, if I'm going to make a modern whiskey, why would I call it a person, place, or animal? You know, like that's sort of like talking to a bygone era. So that was a really easy decision to make. But let me tell you, when you take people, places, and animals out of the list of names you can choose, then, you know, it gets really small very, very quickly. And so look, you know, Starward really is just this idea that we wanted to kind of reach for the stars with this idea of a modern sharing cabinet whiskey. And, you know, we just wanted to push the conversation of whiskey forward, you know, with this idea that, you know, whiskey doesn't have to be bourbon or Scotch or Irish whiskey. It can be Australian whiskey, it can be Japanese whiskey, it can be whiskey from Wales or you know, the Pacific Northwest, you know. So, you know, that's kind of where the name Starward came from.
So David, I don't know if you know this, but within this culture, I guess, of single barrel selecting single barrels, right? And then having different clubs, like most clubs actually personalize their selections with what we call tater stickers, or, you know, custom stickers that a lot of times play on some sort of a cultural, pop culture aspect of it, or just a cheeky name. Have you seen the sticker we created for your bottle?
I've seen a few, but you're gonna have to refresh my memory.
I'll show you. I don't know if you can see it. It's probably not going to come out.
Yes, I have seen that one. Yeah, you know, the between the futuristic aspect of it and talking, you know, like you know, S and D on the keyboard are right next to each other. So like Star Wars, it's kind of like
It's well, it's a nod to a DC comic, right? So legendary Starward. It's a legendary star. I can't remember the character's name now. Crap, I have had too much whiskey, but it's a DC comic. Yes, thank you. So it's a play on that, but there's also a more subtle nuance that not a lot of people can pick up. It's seriously weeded winter, and seriously is spelled like a star that you guys have, Sirius Star in Australia.
very well done.
So yeah, I just yeah.
It was a contender actually for the name for start. Like the business name was going to be Sirius. Which is a great segue into this last whiskey. Thank you. We're back in wheat. So this is 100% wheat whiskey, number one. Number two, it's basically a single barrel, which is pretty special. And single barrels are always done at cask strength. This one is 116. So a little higher than normal. Like we typically fill our barrels at 110. It's one of the older barrels that we've ever released as a single barrel, coming in at nearly 7 years, like six years and 9 months, I think it is. And one of maybe 3 single wheat whiskies we've ever launched, right? So this is by far and away, and it was in a 225-liter barrique. So that's kind of an American bourbon sort of sized barrel. We only got 180 bottles out of it. Typically, we get 240. So this is by far and away one of the rarest barrels we've ever launched in the United States. Wheat, 116 proof. Now, the kicker on this is that it's neither a pair of barrels from Australia, nor red wine barrels. This is Pedro Jimenez barrels from Spain. A second fill Pedro Jimenez barrel from Spain. So we did a single malt whiskey in this barrel first, which we launched, I'm going to say in well, we can do the math, right? 2013, 2014. And then we filled it with grain spirit, wheat spirit from the column for 7 years, and that's what we're drinking right now. I'm telling you now, this is one of my favorite ever single barrels. And yes, I probably say that about a lot of them, but I really, really, really mean it for this one. 100% wheat in a PX barrel.
I'll tell you a little anecdote about selecting this barrel. So how it happened was completely by accident. As many great things, some serendipity and luck is involved. And I knew your ex-ambassador in this market. And so we got to talking, and he was following our Instagram account. And then he reached out to me and he said, hey, you guys are doing all these great barrels. I might have an option for you. And this option might be all, kind of like from the left field, so to speak, but you should consider it. And I said, well, what is it? And he goes, well, it's Starward brand. And I knew about the brand because I just came back from London at that point, and I had your expression. I don't remember which one it was, but it was really good at the restaurant. With the meal, it was excellent. So I said, oh, I just had it, send samples. So he sends me a box. It's not going to come on Zoom, but it's a huge box with maybe 11 or 12 different expressions of every single wine finish there was. And then one was, that last one, the wheated. But when I do tastings, and when we do it as a club with other people, we almost always do it blind, right? Not to be affected by what's in the bottle and just kind of judging on the spirit alone. And most of the stuff that I drank at that point had very pronounced influence of wine, which is not a bad thing. It's just not something that I was ready to pick from. And then I get to this last expression, and it was literally the last thing I tasted, and it was completely different. It was a fruit bomb. I could tell that it's a wheated, because on the label it said single grain. It didn't say what it was. And I was trying to guess what it was, and I was right. It was a wheat, right? It was very predominantly very classic wheat influence on the palate, on the nose, and everything. And I called them back, and I'm like, I think we have a winner. And then, even at that point, I wasn't sure if people was going to go for it. But as a lot of times we do, we take a flyer on something that we personally love and can live with. And so this was definitely one of those barrels.
I'm telling you now, this will never happen again. Right.
Oh, there you go.
So I'm like, it's just, we don't import barrels from Spain. Right. So if you are that sort of person that likes to collect whiskies, this is definitely one. And I'm shameless plug, but I'm telling you now, we're not doing this again. This is definitely one to buy and one to keep, because wheat in PX barrels, just unheard of. Full aging.
I'll tell you another a little anecdote. I just came back from Vegas. I was there for work. I was actually conducting a few whiskey tastings of single barrel selections that we've done for the NFT project that we're kind of rolling out at the end of the month, at the end of the year. And there was an NFT conference, and they did a series of whiskey tastings for their VIPs. So those are the people that predominantly like Scotch, not so much bourbon, but Scotch, and have the means to back it up, because it's a very expensive habit. So most of them never seen the Starward bottle, and haven't even heard about the brand. And so I was pouring them this among other selections, and I was doing it blindly, and people loved it. They absolutely loved it. So again, it's the end of the testament to you, not so much to us, it's to you. You made the whiskey. We just happened to stumble into it, but it's a great tasting one. And for the people that haven't tried it, it's interesting. Like when we release barrels, normally they don't necessarily last too long. They get sold out within a day or two. Some last a little longer. And so this one, we still have a little bit of inventory left, but I think this is because people did not really know what to expect. And for the people that did buy a bottle, they came back for seconds and sometimes for thirds. So I'm kind of hoping that, this tasting today opens up a few more eyes, and people really become a fan of not just the selection, but the entire portfolio.
Yeah, look, that's exactly right. I think now it has some context, right? And also the rest of the portfolio, whether it be even this is the same wheat we put in twofold, right? All of it sort of now, you're getting a bigger picture of that family tree of barrels and what the wheat's doing what the malt's doing, what the different types of barrels we age our whiskey in does. I'd love for you guys to, I'd be happy to do a deconstruction, and talk about, for example, a French oak, an American oak, a shaved toasted rechard, a wet filled barrel, in that wine, portfolio, and then a barrique and a hogshead, 300 and 200. We could go all, different ways, and sort of like going for a wander in the bond store and sort of have a bit of a play there. But I'm telling you now, that barrel is a cracking pick.
I was trying to tell people that this is rare. I didn't realize how rare exactly it was.
Yeah. Like we just don't do this. Like, it was basically a second fill barrel of a PX barrel from the single malt. So it's just not something we continue to do, because we just focus on red wine, and then every now and then we do some crazy stuff like ginger beer cask whiskey, or we've got a peated whiskey coming out later this year, and fun things like that.
So, I mean, look, I hope this is a beginning of a long-standing relationship where we do this, on a certain cadence, so to speak, and people are adventurous enough to kind of trust us and trust our members that select barrels with us, our palates. But the best way to do this is this. And so, like, for the people that are on this call, I'd like to hear from you guys. You can unmute yourselves. What do you think about this as means to get introduced to different brands? Number one. Number two, what's your favorite expression out of all five? And if you don't say it's a single barrel, you're not going to offend me. And then number three, should we do this again with others? I'd love to hear your feedback. I'll mute myself, unmute yourself, and whoever wants to chime in, do so.
I love the Solero and the single barrel. Both of those just fantastic. And I'm hoping you can ship to Florida.
We can, and we do almost daily. So yes, the short answer there is yes. That's my favorite expressions as well. I do like Octave as well. But if I had to pick two, obviously I'm partial to our selection, but out of the core SKUs, I think if you have Solera on your shelf, and you want to have a conversation piece with your whiskey drinking friends, this is certainly is that.
I just ordered 2 Soleras and a single barrel, so
Well, thank you.
to go with the ones we already have. So
Hey, the faster we deplete the inventory, the faster we're going to do another barrel. So it kind of works for everybody.
Hey, I thought this format was excellent tonight. It was a great introduction. I really appreciate the effort.
Great. I'm actually working on a couple other events just like this one. So I'm glad to hear that. If there are any, by the way, David, this is the first one we're doing. So you are truly trailblazer in more ways than one. And I'm so happy that you were able to join us. Because again, like the plan, I wasn't sure if David, he has a busy schedule. So I wasn't sure if he's going to find some time for us, but I'm very happy that he did. We're going to have these things occur on very more often with other people, with other brands, because I think this is probably the best way to get introduced to the entire portfolio. You might have tried a selection here or there, and at the very approachable price point of the kit, you get the entire selection. You'd pay a lot more at the bar if you can find it at the bar. So
you need more big guy T-shirts. There weren't enough 3XLs.
I can get you one. I can get you one.
No, of the Starward.
The Starward. That David is your guy then. I can't help there.
Big healthy guys. David, this is the first one. Oh, I can't see it. It's a Starward single cask whiskey. I got this like 2 years ago. This is my 3rd bottle. Great pour.
Is the Solera sold out online?
No, sir. I just bought one
You get the last one?
through D Wine Spot.
Ah, okay.
Hold on. Let me check on something. It should be sold out on the wine spot. Is
I
it?
just bought a single barrel.
Does it say sold out?
Let me check.
If I did, I got the last one. Sorry.
No, but we can get more. That's not, I don't think that's a problem. I mean, Katrina, are you still there? Is it available?
I'm still here, and yes, it is still available. We can make it happen.
There you go. Let me see. No, it's still available on the Wine Spot site. Yeah, that's what I thought. I think they have some stock of it as well, if I'm not mistaken. So.
They're actually showing octave barrels on their on the Wine Spot website.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah, they're there.
So I have a question. Katrina said, funny you should say that, Mike, when I mentioned twofold being at a higher ABV. Is there something coming in the works?
David, I'm gonna let you discuss as much as you're able to discuss about
I
that.
see Michael has a smile on his face, so I know something's up.
I have no idea. I want to know the same thing.
Okay.
No, I think there's definitely you know what? Let me I think one of the things that we're always thinking about is price point, right? And in Australia, tax is volumetric like it is in Washington state. So genuinely, I can buy a bottle at LA, put it in a FedEx case, overnight it to the distillery, and it would be cheaper than it is for me to sell it to you from over the bar. Such is the tax in Australia. So we've got a very prohibitive tax system that's based on proof. Now, over in the States, proof is less of an issue when it comes to the end price point. So we're looking at very, very early stages. We're looking at what that means, particularly for twofold, because I think that, as you can see with this particular product, and it's more than just obviously the spirit, but you know, I think that if there's an opportunity to bump it up to say 90, that would be a great thing, but I'm not going to make any promises. It's still very, very early days.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Yeah.
I think everybody agrees.
It's interesting, like, you know, Maker's Mark is what, 90 here, right? Like, I think it's at 90 proof.
Well, it starts there, but
80.
there's 101 too, you know, and higher.
Yeah, of
Maker.
course.
The cash drink makers, there's 101 makers, you know.
Yeah, but there's like just the standard makers in this United States is 90, or it's 80.
It's funny, I've got the cask 46 setting aside as my A-B comparison because it's my standard that I compare everything against just to have a baseline.
Nice, I like that.
Yeah.
I'll take that comparison.
And you did well to, finish that thought there. It very different pours, but the quality, the complexity, the depth, you find more things as you drink it and as it opens up. So it's very enjoyable and it holds up well in comparison for sure.
Well, I'm glad you finished that off. You kept me hanging for a second there. I was like, oh God.
Yeah, I think most folks, when it comes to makers, they're more in the higher proof ones than the standard. You use it as a mixer, I guess. You can find it it's a bar and mixer. Everybody has that lower, but I think everybody here who loves makers, usually has a higher proof version of it to appreciate it. I've got the winning ticket still, a little bit left of that, and I love it. It's great. It's another prime barrel.
I actually picked another one just recently. By the way, and this is a tangent, obviously, but Makers is an interesting brand. It has a rich history, right? It's one of the longest lasting brands out there, and it's ubiquitous with American bourbon. You go into any country in the world, just about, and if you go into any bar, they'll have Makers. It's a recognizable bottle. It's an iconic bottle, one would say. And the whiskey quality is actually pretty good, but because it's so ubiquitously available everywhere, it gets bad rep. It gets, I can always get it. I'm not going to spend my money on it. But once you go to the distillery and experience it for yourself, and I see Stephen there on the line. Stephen, he was a part of that selection that we did in person. Their barrel program, or I should say, single barrel program, is unique in more ways than one. They don't have single barrels for you to pick from as you normally would. You actually get to blend your own recipe, and there are memory serves over 1,000 possible combinations, because what they do, they have the, they have the regular recipe of their mash bill. But what they do, they infuse the barrel with different wood staves, and every wood stave has a unique tasting characteristic, and it has a different effect on the final product. And you get to, and there are 10 of them. There's 5 flavors, 2 of each. And so you get to play with any permutation of those wooden staves. And you literally can be there for days playing with it. And to their credit, they have brand ambassadors that know exactly what they're doing. You start off the whole experience with describing your preferred profile. And the dirty little secret is that you almost never get to that profile. But what happens along the way, you start appreciating different characteristics of different blends that you're creating. And you might end up with completely something different from what you are started off to wanting to get. But the final product is nonetheless very exciting. And I think that's exactly what ended up second time around. And we're getting dangerously close to basically creating the same recipe of staves recipes as our first time. And at which point I said, yeah, hold on, time out. We're not going to do the same thing again, but let's do something else. Let's experiment. And I think, and I was lucky enough to still have remnants of our first selection. And we recreated the first selection in that room, and people that were there unanimously picked the second bottle as being a better tasting one. So for those who are, who enjoy Maker's Mark and specifically enjoyed our first selection, the second one should be even better. So that's coming around.
Put me on.
Sorry?
Make sure mailing list.
Yeah, no problem. You got it. You'd be surprised. We send a lot of stuff to Australia. There's a lot of bourbon drinkers in Australia, specifically bourbon. And I'm very familiar with your draconian tax system and duties. It's insane. Yeah.
Yeah, that changes someday.
I hope that does too. Yeah. But look, I mean, and this is a good example of, like, for me, the different types of barrels that we have in Bond kind of give us that kind of opportunity to have that conversation as well, but they're just already aged. I love the makers program, and I love the distillery, and I think that, just coming back to where we started all of this, obviously there's a different horse for every course, and with our whiskey clubs and barrel pick program, we've got you well and truly covered, between the wheat whiskies and the 140 different types of barrels and the single malt whiskies. It'd be great to do a side by side, same wood policy, same winery, same fill date, different spirit, and then what happens if you do 60-40 of that? Does it turn into twofold? Probably not. You know what I mean? Like, and this is kind of the sum of the parts thing. So there's lots of different ways we can take it, and I'm looking forward to us kind of doing this more frequently and spreading the good word for Starward. So that's the biggest thing, beyond buying the single barrel, which is a slam dunk. If you guys can start spreading the word of this great Aussie whiskey that's doing some interesting things, I'd be forever grateful. We're always doing single barrels. Check out the website, subscribe to the newsletter, all of the shameless plugs. Would be great.
On my bucket list, I certainly want to go to Scotland to do the whole, whiskey and Scotch experience, and perhaps select a barrel and bring it over if it's not prohibitively expensive. And I certainly want to go to Australia. And if we go, you can expect a group of us coming over and enjoying your company and perhaps selecting another barrel. So for people that would actually want to do that, hit me up. We'll set it up. I'm only half joking, as I said. So
Good. 110.
Yeah.
Quite low. Makers.
that's
Straight
right.
pull from Makers Art.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. Because mentioned Makers, I was thinking, okay, what's your barrel entry proof like Makers? That's what you got me thinking about that. So okay, it's the same basically. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And your distillation proof is probably not very high either. Like
72.
What was that?
72.
Oh, distillation proof?
Yeah.
You distill at 72? Really? Oh, that's really low.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
you got to. It's single malt, right? With
Yeah.
the wheat spirit, it's a lot higher, obviously. Yeah, I actually can't remember off the top of my head now, but like it's high 80s.
Oh.
72 ABV, so that's 100 and
Oh, okay, ABV. Okay, I'm thinking proof. I'm like, what? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, 72 would be water.
I was like, what? I was very confused. Sophie, thank you for clarifying that. I'm like, what? It's late.
yeah, exactly.
Past my bedtime.
Okay, well, allegedly we could, but we would never would. I mean, just the name hazmat says it all. This comes back to Pilsner versus hazy IPA, double dry hopped. You know, what man?
Yeah.
No,
lot-
restraint. Yeah,
A lot of people
but
don't- the whole
distillery, you might be able to kind of twist their arm.
I was sorry, not to interrupt you, but a lot of people don't realize that the whole single barrel program for any distillery is really not their moneymaker, right? It's just
Not at all.
a marketing ploy, really, to get people, to build brand loyalty. Really, that's what it comes down to. A lot of it is just being able to scale their core expressions. So you have to kind of like consider that as well when wishing for new products. But I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this is a good time to pause. I think we've had a good experience. But for what it was, I think it went great. But obviously, I'm biased. I do want to thank our host, David. Thank you so much for being willing to do this with us. It's not easy, especially with the time difference. I do want to thank our members for making time. On both coasts, right? So it's a nationwide club. So like everybody is different. I do hope it was worth the time. Do hit me up. I just provided my email in the chat. If you have any feedback or even Discord, that's a good platform to do it as well. By the way, David, if you'd like to have your own channel within our Discord community, we have a pretty active whiskey community, and Katrina definitely knows about it.
Yeah.
More than happy to create a brand channel for you where you can interact with our members directly.
Yeah, I've just put my email in there. So if for those of you in the Pacific Northwest, hit me up and we'll just kind of have a little meetup. I've got a great bar to head up to in Belltown that'd be happy to have us.
All right. So with that being said, any last comments? Speak now, forever hold your peace.
Thanks for doing this to both of you. It's a great product, tastes great. Look forward to many more bottles.
Awesome. And Ken, because I see you and you remind me of Black Button, those bottles are shipping this week. We finally got them. So
Can't wait.
Yeah, we have David, just for your own background, we just did a custom blend as a club, and obviously it takes time for the distillery to finish out the blend, and those just got delivered to us today.
Looking forward to a little umptiousness.
Absolutely. All right, guys. On that note, I'm going to let David go and let you get back to your families and your evenings. Thank you so much for being here. Definitely we're going to do this again. But for now, cheers and have a good night.
Cheers. Thank you,
Have a
guys.
good night. Thank you
very much, David. Thanks. Bye.